Far, far away from the skyscrapers of Tokyo, Mark Robert Karpelès was born on a hot day in June 1985 in Chenôve, in the Burgundy region. His mother, a schoolteacher from a modest background, raised him alone. Anne Karpelès is a mother who lives life her way.
I don't think I'm a geek. I spend 5 or 6 hours a day playing MMOs. I make raids. I'm starting to be very good at raids. Yesterday, I managed to socket all my architect stuff.
Yes!
Anne Karpelès is crazy about IT and programming. So her son didn't play with marbles or cards, but instead started coding little video games at the age of 4.
Saturday mornings were devoted to my son. Every Saturday morning, come rain or shine or whatever, even if there was a world war, on Saturday mornings I was with my son. So we read, I created some computer programs for him to play with. I had a Sinclair, and the advantage of a Sinclair was that you could do programming.
The Sinclair was a basic computer, which fascinated young Mark. He spent hours in the twists and turns of the machine's binary code.
I remember when he was still in nursery, we created dinosaurs in pixels. We made pixels and then the little dinosaurs. And after that, I coded it all in binary on the Sinclair. And you could see the little dinosaurs on the screen. He was fascinated from the start.
Mark Karpelès preferred the keyboard to construction toys and the virtual world to toy cars. He was a bright little boy, and in particular, very precise and meticulous.
He was a curious child, cheerful, happy. And when he set to work on something, he was extremely focused.
He learned quickly, much more quickly than other children of his age. Before he started school, he could already read and count perfectly.
In the first year of primary school, the teacher had very fixed ideas about what a child should know at certain times of the year. And unfortunately, my son was way ahead.
That year, Anne had her son's intelligence tested. The result was a much higher than average. With an IQ of 190, the boy was officially classed as a genius. Julien Laglace met Mark Karpelès in Japan 20 years later. As a close friend, he knows about his spectacular ability to learn.
He does things at double speed, quite naturally. If he likes something, he'll see something, read something, and take it on board right away. To make an analogy with the Matrix, it's like when Neo is plugged in at the beginning of the film, and he learns kung fu and how to fly a helicopter. Mark's a bit like that. He learns something, and it's assimilated.
We knew he was gifted. He had an intellectual age of 12 when he was 7.
But this overdeveloped intelligence didn't fit into traditional education and placed Mark outside the school system. In 1992, Anne changed her job and was able to move to find a specialized school. They left the countryside for Paris. At the age of 7, the boy discovered the capital city. His mother found a small one-bedroom apartment here in the 15th arrondissement. Nearby, he started his Parisian life in this school suited to his little genius's brain. At the age of 12, he wanted to work in robotics. It's hard to imagine that this tranquil little boy could be suspected 20 years later of being one of the biggest financial criminals in Japan. In the middle of the 1990s, his mother sealed his future.
When we were in Paris, I was able to buy a Macintosh, and we saw the appearance of hypertext. Hypertext is when you click on a link. The idea You could be sent from one thing to another, and then another. And then you could record data from one place and put it in something else. Was completely fascinating to him.
With the increased IT possibilities offered by the internet, the young teenager became troubled. He developed an almost clinical obsession with his computer. David Perron is one of the few sociologists to have figured out how geek culture works, where IT plays an important part.
In the people I've met, I've seen a sort of desire for control, which they don't have in real life, so they want to get it elsewhere. It's simply the pleasure of having control over things that are more easily controlled than the complexity of the world we live in. IT is very complex. It requires a lot of work, but once you've mastered coding, you start to see how it all works inside, so that it becomes a pleasure to discover what goes on behind and to think you might be able to do the same thing. The ultimate idea would be to have a pure brain, a sort of artificial intelligence, to be able to project yourself into a computer. That's a common fantasy.
In the 90s, IT and video games often went with comic books, genre films, and TV shows, but especially manga. Thanks to these Japanese comics, a brightly colored imaginary world opened up to Mark Karpelès.
We lived in the 15th arrondissement, so we were only 15 to 20 minutes from the Japanese Cultural Center. We went there nearly every weekend.
He was interested in Japan as a teenager. I know he watched a lot of animes, and still does. It was kind of the kids' TV that a lot of teenagers watched.
Japan was a fantastic and fantasy country that Mark idealized more and more.
Japan, because it's a non-Western country and it looks a bit different from our world, represents a kind of fantasy of new horizons, where you could take on all the fantasies of this country of the future, which was Japan as it was imagined.
But in the 1990s, it wasn't easy being a geek. In films and TV shows of the time, the geek was usually a pale, uncool teenager who was called all sorts of names.
Nerd, no-life, geek. There are other words in English that we don't use so much, like dork, things like that. They basically mean loser, people who are separate and different. There's often the idea that they are antisocial, strange, and too focused. The classic geek is a boy, not very tall, skinny, pale, with big glasses. The glasses are a symbol of their intellectuality, a control, and spending too much time on intellectual activities.
Naturally, Mark wasn't the most popular teenager in his school. At 15, he isolated himself more and more, preferring the company of his manga characters.
He couldn't find a friend who was like him, who could talk about cooking, IT, quantum physics, manga, etc.
Ill at ease, hyper-intelligent but very naive, Mark was the perfect teenage victim. In 2001, he'd just entered high school, when a few months later he was a victim of a violent racket.
He doesn't know how to say no. And as he's kind and nice and brilliant, he attracts people. Good people and not so good. This was an organized gang that threatened young people to make them steal their parents' credit cards and then use them to buy mobile phones, but not 5 or 6. It was 200 to 300, which they sold cheap. My bank account was emptied, and so was my mother's.
Mark's high school years became more and more intolerable. He could have done brilliantly at university, but once he passed his baccalaureate, he gave it all up in 2003, convinced that he could get things together on his own. He found a studio apartment a few streets away from his mother, and then, at the age of 18, he found his first job.
He got a job as a developer. It wasn't very senior, but the company didn't take on many people. It was a small structure.
He wanted to give me space. He realized that things were pretty difficult, especially as my mother was very angry because she'd lost all her money. We never got that money back.
In this small video game company, Mark felt perfectly at ease with his IT superpowers. But the gifted youth soon got bored. He took liberties with his boss's website and created his own security program.
Mark had revised the whole website and had written a fairly simple little program to detect bugs. It was applicable to any forum.
A few years later, in 2007, Gilles Ridel became Mark Karpelès' second boss. He recognizes the difficulties that the young geek had in his first job.
Mark isn't a typical employee. He makes his own world. It's difficult to work with him, to collaborate, because he has a vision, a way of doing things, his own intelligence and his style. To get him to share his coding with other people, he'd need to find a disciple who was at his level, and that's not easy. So it's true that, on the whole, Mark developed what he developed on his own. Those kinds of people can go either way in a company. Either they work in the same direction as the company, they fit in and they bring an advantage to the company, or they're badly managed or not managed at all, and then things can quickly go wrong.
Used to programming on his own since he was a child, Mark took more and more personal initiatives. In 2005, he put systems in place to divert confidential data from the company.
His employer discovered two things. He first discovered that client data had been exfiltrated to a server belonging to Mark Karpelès. So that meant basically that he was taking information that didn't belong to him, which belonged to the company, and keeping it at home, to put it in simple terms. And secondly, his employer discovered that a domain name, so an internet address, which belonged to the company, was linked to a website that belonged to Karpelès. So the boss quite simply suspected fraud.
Donc là, le directeur soupçonne une arnaque tout simplement.
About this time, a blog appeared on the internet, written by a mystery person called Magical Tux. In French, this means magical penguin. The name was a direct reference to the brand character of Linux, an open-source operating system very popular with IT programmers. Behind this avatar was Mark Karpelès, who updated his blog every day. Soon he began writing about his bad relationship with his boss.
He said about his problems with his employer that it was linked to his depressed state at the time. I think it was a period when he rarely went to his workplace because he said he was depressed and couldn't go there every day.
Mark ended up resigning in 2005. His first experience of work was a failure, and worse, his boss filed a complaint against him for hacking. Aged only 20 and out of work, he took refuge behind his screen. Although Mark wasn't very sociable in real life, Magical Tux was becoming more and more popular in the nerd community.
In 2005, there were already quite a lot of blogs, but he gained a certain following because he wrote a lot, because he wrote for a certain community, which he himself identified with. So he gained an audience.
Night and day, Magical Tux gave advice on coding, IT security, but also a few little tips for hacking. Through hanging out in forums, in 2007, he was noticed by a film crew who were making a documentary about geek culture. The film Suck My Geek revealed the person behind Magical Tux.
Dans la vie réelle, quand je veux causer avec quelqu'un qui est dans le métro, je suis jamais qu'un inconnu. Alors que si je me ramène sur Internet, je suis Magical Tux.
This was really the time when I saw on internet forums an explosion in the use of the word geek as a self-identifier. That documentary crystallized that. It created a fairly wide movement of recognition. There was the geek who was into horror movies, the one who was into video games, and then there was Mark Karpelès, who wasn't known by that name yet. He was Magical Tux in the documentary, who was presented as a caricature of the IT geek.
Ça fait 3-4 ans qu'on est ensemble, on est très bien. En fait, j'ai passé un certain temps à être coupé complètement du monde.
Il dit qu'il n'a pas d'amis.
He said that he had no friends, apart from in JPEG and Avid, which are two computer file formats. That his hobbies were quantum physics or coding. Basically, he wasn't interested in anything that wasn't to do with IT. The character was clearly almost fictional. He matched every typical geek characteristic. But people knew he existed because his alias was mentioned in the documentary. And if you looked for him on Google, you found forums he'd taken part in on free software, IT, and manga. So you could find traces of his real existence and his credibility as a geek. So he was both a caricature and credible. That made him an interesting character.
Suck My Geek became a cult documentary, and Mark Karpelès a legend in the nerd world. Feeling more confident, he started looking for another job. Outside the Paris ring road lay La Défense and its imposing office blocks. Intimidating company bosses, hurrying people in suits and ties. In the late noughties, e-commerce companies were booming there. Mark shyly pushed open the door of Nextway, a pioneering startup which was growing considerably. There he met Gilles Ridel. The young 22-year-old stood his ground and asked for a huge salary.
I saw him and we talked together, and to all my questions or suggestions, the answer was yes. Everything was possible. Can you do this? Can you do that? Everything was possible. So that seemed pretty amazing. As we talked about what he'd done, I understood why everything was possible for him. He was intelligent, extremely intelligent. So very quickly, we accepted his conditions.
The boss observed his new employee with a mix of distrust and admiration. But after a few months, he found out that Mark had sometimes made use of his hacking talents.
I had a frank conversation with him. I said, look, Mark, there are various indicators that perhaps you come from a world that isn't the same as ours. Perhaps you've acted as a hacker. So either you give me a guarantee that that's in the past, that you're honest with us, we work together, and I give you another chance, or you leave now. And he said, no, Giles, I did some stupid things when I was young, but now I'm doing this. It's my job and I like it.
Gilles Ridel took a gamble and agreed to teach him to use his superpowers without going to the dark side of the internet.
When you're talking about geeks, there's a bit of autism involved. They're a bit withdrawn. They're in their own world. These are kids that keep going unless you tell them not to. So they keep going. They have no limits. That's Mark. If you don't say stop, he keeps going. If you say stop, he understands. If I say don't do that for this or that reason, he understands perfectly.
Mark worked constantly, day and night. For the first time, he seemed to have found stability among people who accepted his almost pathological obsessions with kindness.
He got up in the morning. He went to bed. It was in his hand. It was 24 hours a day. He was working for Nextway. He worked on the train. He worked at home, on Saturdays, Sundays. It was 24 hours a day, online and development.
When he gets involved in something, he's 100% involved. So there were weekends when he stayed in the office. When there were problems, they called Mark, and he went there right away to sort them out.
He became the sort of technical lead. When there were major problems, we called Mark. When a project was running late, we called Mark. He became the man who did everything.
For 2 years, Mark kept to the rules. But the young geek hadn't forgotten his fantasy about a place that was more exciting than La Défense and its grey buildings. When he was only 24, he felt ready for his great adventure. Alone, 6,000 miles away from home. Japan, the geek's El Dorado, the country of all Mark's fantasies. In 2009, when he arrived in Tokyo, he finally discovered the city he had idealized since childhood. He came across characters like his manga, and lost himself in this brightly colored, luminous, and effervescent city. Here, technology and gadgets were everywhere, and the economy was booming. In this culture, he could finally be himself.
It was his childhood dream. He always wanted to go to Japan.
It was a dream come true. At last, he was in this culture that had attracted him for so many years, and he could explore it and live in it. You can tell that he felt fulfilled, at least according to what he wrote in his blog. From the start, it was this idea of Japan as the place where everything was possible for someone like him. That otaku or geek culture was something that was integrated into society, a normal part of society.
His brain was at boiling point. He learned Japanese in just a few months, determined to become a real native of Tokyo.
He'd started learning Japanese. So when he arrived in Japan, he could speak what's known as business Japanese.
Mark had the ability to, when he sees something, he remembers it, whether it's IT or languages. As he watched a lot of animes when he was a teenager, that helped him to learn Japanese. When he arrived in Japan, he couldn't speak fluently, but he already spoke Japanese well.
Julien Leglace, also a developer, met Mark at that time and became a friend of the independent, solitary young man who'd moved there to be his own boss. On the 29th of October 2009, he joined him when Mark started his company, which he named after his cat Tiban. The idea wasn't revolutionary, it was a simple company developing websites. But Julien Leglace had confidence in this daring and brilliant young man.
To work in Tokyo, you need a good knowledge of Japanese. So finding a job in the late noughties wasn't easy. Setting up your own company is on a completely different level. It's really not easy to do that. He wanted to be an entrepreneur, to discover new things, to get into areas that he didn't necessarily know. Yes, I think he had the soul of an entrepreneur.
Karpelès was again incapable of facing the real world and its complexities. In Paris in 2010, the trial instigated by his first employer began. In spite of the serious hacking accusations, Mark Karpelès was again incapable of facing the real world and its complexities.
When the trial happened, my son said, "No, I'm innocent. I don't need to go to the trial." He didn't think to ask his mother. Under French law, if the person accused doesn't appear in court, they must be guilty.
The verdict was harsh. He was given a suspended sentence of 1 year and fined 45,000 euros in damages for hacking and data theft. Safe in Tokyo, Mark Karpelès buried his head in the sand and preferred to live out his Japanese dream, which took an unexpected turn. At the age of 25, Mark met a Japanese woman, got married, and even became a father. Communicating as well as ever, he naturally didn't think of telling his family.
My son completely omitted to tell me that he got married. Yes, he did tell me I was a grandmother. I said, "That's very nice. But who with?" "Oh, damn." "Yes, I think you forgot to tell someone about your wedding."
A family, a company. Apart from the guilty verdict in Paris, everything seemed perfect. But it was a chance conversation with a client that would really turn his life upside down.
One of his clients at Tiban, his company where he managed accommodation, asked if he could be paid in Bitcoin. I think it was that person who told Mark about Bitcoin.
Bitcoin was a virtual currency created just a year earlier.
Bitcoin is a cryptographic currency. It's a currency that exists on the internet, which allows anyone to exchange securities, called bitcoins, very freely and simply, which can then be exchanged for euros or dollars using the internet network, and all this in a very secure way.
Bitcoin is distributed and only relies on the size of the network itself to make it secure. So it's a decentralized currency.
Mark was immediately intrigued. He was fascinated by the technology and wanted to understand everything about the system. He immersed himself in scientific, technological, and IT publications. He wanted to know everything about this cryptocurrency. Even before seeing a way to make money, he wanted to be part of the Bitcoin adventure.
He wanted to test the technology. It was a good way to test the technology. He wanted to see how Bitcoin evolved. He wanted to see what he could do with it, aside from the financial aspect, which didn't interest him at the start. At the time when he bought Bitcoin, it was worth virtually nothing. It was really to test the new technology and to see how it could potentially rival existing currencies.
How could this currency compete with other currencies? And which companies were already using it? He headed to Shinjuku, in the business neighborhood of Tokyo. Amongst the towers, he found this company, Mt. Gox, one of the few platforms which used the cryptocurrency. At the time, the company specialized in the exchange of magic cards, a game set in the heroic fantasy world where two-headed trolls and wizards battle each other with spells.
Maybe it appealed to Mark's geeky side, with the magic card game, which is very popular in the geek world. The cards have different properties. It's a role-playing game, a battle between several players.
In March 2011, Mark bought Mt. Gox for almost nothing. His idea was to use the existing platform and replace the magic cards with bitcoins. Kim Nielsen is Swedish. He's investigating the Mt. Gox case independently from Japanese investigators, but in 2011, he suspected nothing and was among the platform's first clients.
It's a trading place where you would if you want to buy bitcoins, you would send Mt. Gox your regular money throughout a normal bank transfer. And then on Mt. Gox, you would be able to trade this money for bitcoin with other people on an open exchange.
Mt. Gox was one of the first Bitcoin exchange platforms. At the same time, the cryptocurrency was in the media more and more, and new accounts were being opened every day. That aroused the interest of cybercriminals.
Certain people could see big monetary potential behind it, and he was getting regular IT attacks, pretty much every day. It was a bit like owning a bank with lots of money in it, and robbers tried to hold it up every day.
On the 19th of June 2011, 3 months after the launch of Mt. Gox, Mark Karpelès was the victim of his first bug. Hackers managed to infiltrate his security system, stealing 400,000 bitcoins, or $9 million. The site closed down abruptly, and Karpelès disappeared for 48 hours.
No transactions were possible, no deposits or withdrawals either. During the 48 hours, Mark worked constantly, without sleeping, and he recoded the whole infrastructure in order to get around the bug to be able to reopen Gox as quickly as possible. Like any service that's interrupted for 48 hours, there were complaints. People asked what was going on. You can see that he reacted almost with panic. He communicated very badly. You can tell that he was realizing for the first time the scope of the business he was now in.
Mark was a very bad communicator, but a formidable developer. As if he was in a magic card game, he fought battle upon battle to regain his nervous clients' loyalty. A few days after the bug on an online forum, he reassured them by making a transfer of 424,242 bitcoins, the equivalent of $170 million.
Mark made the transfer after Mt. Gox reopened to prove that Gox was still solvent and the company still had money.
But Mark wanted to send a message to the geeks, his core target. So on the forum, he included direct references to a Bible of geek culture, the odd amount of 424,242 bitcoins, and the message with it, 42 is the answer.
It comes from a science fiction book, H2G2, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It was also a movie. Geeks love to play with references. It shows their expertise and knowledge, which they cultivate. It gives a social aspect. Did you get the reference? So did I. We're in it together. I've interviewed lots of geeks wearing t-shirts with 42 on, or other similar references. It's quite a romantic idea.
And his strategy worked. His clients gradually came back. Within a few months, Mt. Gox had doubled its client base. Ken Shishido, like many others at the time, was among the wave of new users who were drawn in by Mt. Gox to using this virtual currency.
When Bitcoin price started going up from $10 to $250, that's 25-fold in short of 1 or 2 months. That had attracted a lot of attention, and suddenly people got so excited and they really had to be in a long queue to open account at Mt. Gox.
The most important thing for an exchange platform is liquidity. The greater the volume of exchanges, the more people who are on it, and it creates a network effect. There was a surge effect, which meant that Mt. Gox quickly became the benchmark for exchanging Bitcoin.
Around this time, Thomas Glucksmann, a marketing specialist, applied to Mt. Gox. He went to the company offices to meet the young Frenchman everyone was talking about.
The first time I met Mark, I didn't know that he was CEO because he was fiddling with, I think it was the programming of the automatic door or something like that. And he was dressed in a t-shirt with some sort of geeky slogan and jeans. So I assumed he was probably the IT technician or a developer who was just quite, hands-on with fixing the door.
He was hired and witnessed the company's dizzying rise.
So people came to us because they thought, okay, well, Mt. Gox is the, many people used our Bitcoin price as the reference price, or, we had the most media mentions, or we were the one that everybody was talking about. So of course everybody would come to us. During that time, it was able to assume around 70-80% of the market share for those exchanges, Bitcoin exchanges.
2 years later, in 2013, 1 Bitcoin was worth $1,000, and Mt. Gox was handling between $5 to $8 million per day. The more Bitcoin increased in value, the more clients there were, and the more the platform grew. Mark Karpelès was managing 127,000 user accounts and employed about 60 staff. He tripled his workforce in just a year.
We were growing so quickly, and we were really, dominating the space, and there was a lot of media attention on us, and a lot of people wanted to partner with us or invest in us, etc. It was very, very exciting. In a way, we were always thinking that we would become the Google of Bitcoin.
Mt. Gox was compared to Google, Karpelès to Zuckerberg, the founder of Facebook. The young genius was getting his own back. At that time, the world's press was talking about the geek from Dijon who'd become the Bitcoin Baron.
He had a few titles like the Bitcoin Baron or the Bitcoin Godfather. 2 or 3 years before, he was just a developer working for an IT company, and then now he's suddenly in charge of this exchange, which is doing like multi-billion-dollar, trading volumes. In terms of like Bitcoin, and his name is all over the internet and all over the media.
It was the ultimate career path of the geek who succeeded in the digital economy.
Mt. Gox's offices got bigger, but the atmosphere remained geeky and connected. On social media, Karpelès posted these photos of collectible old computers or these amazing pizza burgers.
You know, there was just bits of computers everywhere, wires and new servers. There was always like new gadgets and technology being delivered to the office that he would, I guess, play around with. So he was more of a, I mean, in his office especially, came across as more of a hacker.
Mark was living his childhood dream. He moved to Meguro, south of Shibuya, and the most stylish neighborhood in Tokyo. His apartment was high up in this tower block dominating the city, and it cost $10,000 per month. And he splashed out on a few things, like a bed costing $40,000.
In the media, there was one object that summed up his life in Japan. It was a king-size bed that he bought. It was all over the press, and it became the symbol of his megalomania. There was this guy from Dijon, a geek, who had invested and had some success. And now he thinks he's king of the world. That was his Bitcoin baron period.
It was a big apartment for Tokyo standards, but even for, like, I guess, European standards too. It was a big place, definitely, and I forgot what level it was, but you know, quite high up with a very nice view, and you know, a big TV. You know, definitely had a lot of space dedicated to his cat. It's sort of the kind of apartment that you expect from the CEO of, let's say, like a Fortune 500.
The Bitcoin baron seemed to be living the high life, but in reality, things weren't so bright and shiny. In his tall tower, where he reigned over his Bitcoin kingdom, the king was alone. His wife and son had moved to the outskirts of the city. 2 years after the wedding, the marriage was over.
I went to see my grandson, my son, and my daughter-in-law. In fact, he called me urgently because his wife wanted to divorce. He didn't say that, but yeah. He had a house in the suburbs of Tokyo, a nice little house where his wife and son lived. But he spent the week, and even weekends, in his apartment in Tokyo.
So Mark spent more and more time in the office. But there were problems there too. The company boss might have had 60 employees, but he had trouble delegating. His problems with communicating and forming social relationships started to cause problems within Mt. Gox.
Mark was the type to manage and keep all the decision-making for himself.
As the CEO, he also had responsibilities to sign off on almost everything. So every aspect of operations, every aspect of accounting, every aspect of business development, marketing, any budget or anything that needs to be spent, he had to sign off on that.
Being immersed in his own world, Mark was clearly not up to managing a company like Mt. Gox. By wanting to control everything himself, he made a serious mistake. In mid-2013, Mt. Gox opened accounts in the United States. But Mark Karpelès forgot to declare the platform as an investment fund. The American government then demanded $5 million from him.
Mt. Gox clearly had used American banks to keep funds in dollars. The government at the time was on a bit of a mission against Bitcoin. They'd understood that quite a lot was going on with the currency, and they simply seized the funds linked to Mt. Gox because it was operating in America without a license. There was no doubt that Mark was completely out of his depth.
The empire swayed, but it didn't collapse. Not immediately, anyway. 6 months later, on the 7th of February 2014, the platform abruptly shut down. That day, there was no access. Clients were locked out. They could neither trade nor withdraw their bitcoins.
They had to suspend their trading, they had to suspend their withdrawal, they had to suspend deposits.
Mt. Gox was no longer communicating any information, and no one knew what was really happening. And we're left to simply assume the worst, that maybe the money was all gone, and course, in a sense, that was sort of what had happened.
Radio silence. Mt. Gox published no official information. The website was inaccessible, and Karpelès seemed to have disappeared.
He disappeared. He was overwhelmed by the scope of the event. He was in charge of what had become a large company. Perhaps he wasn't prepared to face up to a crisis situation.
After a week with no answers, clients were panicking. On the 14th of February, this video went viral. This client had more than 300 bitcoins stuck in Mt. Gox, approximately $300,000. He traveled from London to confront the Bitcoin baron.
Do you still have everyone's bitcoins? Do you still have everyone's bitcoins?
Smiling politely, Mark seemed to be out of touch with reality. Paradoxically, he was strangely calm. In the crisis situation, Mark had closed himself off.
This is what he didn't understand, but he didn't accept the gravity of certain situations. And the fact that he didn't understand the gravity of that forces me to believe that he was in another world or his own world.
On the 28th of February 2014, 21 days after the site's shutdown, Karpelès reappeared at last, surrounded by an army of advisors. He had exchanged his geek's t-shirt for a suit and a tie and was prepared to make a public apology. In a Japanese style of repentance in front of the world's media, Mark finally broke his silence.
システムに弱いところがあって、ビットコインがいなくなって、みんなにその結果でご迷惑をかけてしまって本当に申し訳ありませんと思います。
He officially announced the disappearance of 850,000 bitcoins, the equivalent of 500 million at the time. The encrypted files had disappeared from the Mt. Gox servers and were untraceable. Mark Karpelès claimed he'd been hacked by cybercriminals.
He felt like he'd lost a battle with the hackers. A battle that he'd been fighting for several years. Given that he'd had attacks from the beginning of Mt. Gox. Maybe they were just too strong at that particular time. It was a feeling of violation. Theft and violation. Because it was his system that was penetrated and destroyed.
From the time of the announcement, Mt. Gox was placed in bankruptcy. A legal investigation started to find out what had happened. Was it really a case of hacking? Very soon, people started to have doubts. Some specialists, like Kim Nielsen, suspected Karpelès of misappropriating the bitcoins.
The charges against Mark Karpelès is that he manipulated records on the exchange. That this presumably means that he manipulated the numbers or accounts or balances or that sort of thing. And the other charge is of normal misappropriation. That is, he supposedly then took money and used it for non-company related things.
Other people think that he simply lied about Mt. Gox's liquidity. And in reality, the missing 850,000 bitcoins had never existed.
This is what's called a Ponzi scheme, when you use the latest deposits to pay for withdrawals. If someone wanted to make a withdrawal, Mark probably waited for someone to make a deposit and paid the person making the withdrawal with that. So as long as Bitcoin continued to rise in value and people kept coming in, the system worked.
For those close to him, Mark was incapable of such a deception.
Even after Mt. Gox shut down, he was still working to find out what had happened. He could have earned a lot more over the long term than $500 million in one go. He could have carried on running Mt. Gox for years and years. Or he could have sold it after 10 years at an incredible profit.
If you had $400 million in your pocket, would you stay there? Wouldn't you rather go to a tax haven or a place with no extradition? That's what I think. You wouldn't stay there, begging for work.
For a year, Mark remained free. He even cooperated with Japanese police. But in the summer of 2015, the former boss felt something was about to change.
He was working on a Friday. A lot of journalists were outside, more than usual. There was a rumour that he might be arrested, but we'd heard the same rumour 3 weeks before when there was a lot of journalists and nothing had happened.
On the 1st of August 2015, Karpelès was arrested. With his cap pulled down over his face and wearing a tight t-shirt, he didn't look like a baron anymore. The picture was flashed around the world. 6,000 miles away, Anne Karpelès soon heard her son had been arrested.
A friend phoned me that night. She said, "Have you heard about Robert?" "Yes, Robert, because we call him Robert here in France." I said, "What about him?" "He's just been arrested." "What?"
Mark was accused by the Japanese authorities of misappropriating $1 million. He was remanded in custody for 6 weeks before being moved to this prison under constant surveillance.
It's a small cell with a bed, table and chair. He's filmed 24 hours a day. The light is never switched off. He's allowed out for 1 hour a day, surrounded by 5 guards.
He's been placed in total isolation. I find that utterly incredible. You'd think he represented a danger to society, to the world at large. I think it's more important for him to be denied online access than for him to be denied freedom. It's a double punishment. He's in prison and he has no online access. That's intolerable for him.
1 year on, he's still being held in these extreme conditions until the police investigation is complete. In recent months, Anne Karpelès has received news from him.
My son can now write to me, yes. How did it feel when you received his first letter? I was pleased. It took me 3 weeks to reply because I had so much to tell him that I didn't know where to start.
In his cell, cut off from the world and his computer, he's taken refuge in his memories.
Recently, as I've nothing better to do, I've been trying to get my memories straight, good or bad. I have a memory based on space and locations, and it would help me a lot to know where I spent the first 10 years of my life. Maybe with place names and dates, it would be possible to put things in order. The memories are limited, but varied, which makes me think I must have taken part in quite a lot of things.
To protect himself, Mark has done what he knows best and withdrawn into another reality.
Through being locked up and in an intolerable situation, he's accepted the intolerable situation so that it becomes tolerable. I'd like to smash everything, but it's not the answer. That's it.
The little geek from Dijon has come a long way from his childhood dreams and Japanese fantasies. The police are still investigating the Mt. Gox case, and no trial date has been set. Mark Karpelès risks a prison sentence of up to 5 years.